I'm 68 years old, and for 50 of those years, the Gulf of Maine has been my office. I thought I'd seen everything this ocean could throw at a man, from rogue waves to fog as thick as wool. But that morning, I saw something that didn't belong. It wasn't just an iceberg. It was a tombstone, ancient and scarred, and it was bleeding a long black wound down its side. My hands shook as I called it in, my voice cracking over the radio. When the Coast Guard finally arrived, and their sonar mapped what was trapped deep inside that ice, the radio went silent for a full, terrifying minute. They had seen it too. A ghost of the deep returned. Would you have dared to get closer? Let me know in the comments if you would have touched it. And don't forget to subscribe and tell me what city you're watching from. My name is Silas Blackwood. I'm 68 years old, and the Gulf of Maine has been my whole world since I was old enough to bait a hook. My father, his father, and his father before him, all Blackwoods, all drew their living from these same gray, unforgiving waters. I've never known anything else, and never wanted to. My boat, the Sea Heather. She's more a part of me than my own house. I know every groan of her hull, every rattle in her engine. Together we've worked the coast off Bar Harbor for 50 years. I've pulled thousands of lobster pots from the rocky bottom, seen the sun rise over Acadia more times than I can count, and felt the bite of a nor'easter that would send most men running for shore. The sea is a hard master, but it's an honest one. It doesn't play games. Or so I thought. That morning started just like any other Tuesday in May. A thick, wet fog was clinging to the water, so dense you could taste the salt in it. The air was cold, the kind of damp cold that gets right into your bones, but it was familiar, comforting even. I'd had a quick chat on the radio with Thomas Miller, another old-timer out of Winter Harbor, complaining about the price of bait and the fog. Just a normal day. The Sea Heather's engine chugged along at a steady rhythm, a sound as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. I was out on the eastern edge of my grounds, checking my lines, the winch groaning as I hauled the first trap. The sonar was pinging away, painting a picture of the seabed I knew better than the back of my own hand. There was Jordan Ridge, the deep channel next to it. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Then, something changed. It wasn't loud. It was a subtle shift in the world around me. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. It dropped. Not a gradual cooling, but a sudden, sharp plunge, like walking into a meat locker. The air went from damp and chilly to unnaturally frigid. My breath plumed in front of me in a thick, white cloud. The gulls that had been circling my boat, screaming for a piece of bait, went silent. Utterly silent. They just vanished into the fog. An old fisherman's superstition tingled at the back of my neck. When the birds leave, something is wrong. I cut the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening, broken only by the gentle slap of water against the hull. And then I smelled it. It wasn't the usual smell of salt, diesel, and fish. It was something else. A scent of deep, forgotten places. A cold, metallic odor, like ancient, wet stone and rust. I stood there on the deck, every sense on high alert. My eyes strained to pierce the thick white curtain of fog. My sonar was still on, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, a massive, solid return on the screen, where there should have been nothing but open water. It was far too big to be a whale, too dense to be a school of fish. It wasn't moving. It was just there, a blind spot in my own backyard. My heart started a slow, heavy thumping against my ribs. A container ship off course? A rogue barge? I grabbed my air horn and gave it a long blast, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the fog. No answer. I waited a full minute. Nothing. Slowly, I eased the throttle forward, my boat creeping through the water. The cold intensified with every foot I traveled. And then, I saw it. A shape began to resolve itself out of the mist, a wall of darkness against the gray. It wasn't a ship. It was ice. But it was wrong. All wrong. I've seen icebergs before. Plenty of them. Calved off from Greenland, they sometimes drift this far south, clean and bright white, gleaming like jewels in the sun. This was not that. This thing was ancient. It was a dirty, scarred behemoth, its surface pitted and grooved. The ice wasn't white. It was a deep, bruised blue in some places, almost black in others, compressed by pressures and time I couldn't even imagine. It looked less like frozen water and more like a chunk of some dead alien mountain. I circled it slowly, keeping a safe distance. The sheer wrongness of it made the hair on my arms stand up. It didn't belong here. It felt like a trespasser from another time. And then my eyes locked on the feature that had haunted my sleep ever since. Running down its side, from just below the waterline to high up on its jagged peak, was a gash. A dark, ugly scar that looked for all the world like an old wound. It wasn't a natural crack or a fissure. It was a streak of something foreign, something man-made, embedded deep within the ice. My curiosity, the same instinct that makes a man want to see what's in the next pot he pulls, fought against a much deeper, more primal feeling, a gut instinct that was screaming at me to turn the sea heather around and head for the safety of the harbor. I was looking at something that should have stayed lost, something the ocean had tried to bury. What would you have done? Would you have dared to get closer, to see what that black scar really was? Let me know in the comments if you would have touched it. And don't forget to subscribe and tell me what city you're watching from. I cut the engine, letting the Type sea heather drift in the dead quiet. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against my hull and the heavy thud of my own heart in my ears. My curiosity was a physical thing, an itch under my skin that I couldn't scratch. Against every instinct that screamed at me to turn tail and run, I nudged the throttle forward, creeping closer to the monolith of ice. The air grew colder with every foot, a deep, penetrating cold that felt ancient, like it was radiating from the very core of the iceberg. It smelled of the deep ocean, of places that haven't seen the sun in 1,000 years, and something else, rust, a faint, metallic tang that had no business being out here. I circled it, keeping a respectful distance. The thing was a monster, easily the size of a 3-story building, most of its bulk hidden beneath the gray water. It wasn't just old, it felt weary, tired, like it had been on a long, long journey. I grabbed my binoculars from the cabin, my hands clumsy with a strange mix of fear and awe. Through the lenses, the surface came into sharp focus. It was a landscape of its own, with deep crevasses, jagged peaks, and valleys, smoothed by a century of ocean currents. The ice was incredibly dense, a dark, sapphire blue that seemed to swallow the light. This wasn't seasonal ice. This was old ice, compressed by pressures I couldn't fathom, born in a time before my grandfather was even born. My eyes kept coming back to that scar, that ugly black wound running down its flank. Through the binoculars it became clear. It wasn't a mineral deposit, it wasn't algae. It was paint. Old, blistered, flaking paint. The top layer was a flat, industrial black. But underneath, where it had peeled away, I could see a second color. A deep, dark red. The color of dried blood. An old-timer's primer coat. I lowered the binoculars, my mouth suddenly dry. I knew those colors. Every sailor with an ounce of respect for the sea's history knows those colors. The iconic livery of the White Star Line. But it was impossible. Absolutely, utterly impossible. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A piece of a modern ship, a barge, anything. But nothing else used that exact combination. Not in that way. And nothing modern would be entombed in ice this ancient. The Titanic sank in 1912. Over 1,000 miles northeast of here, in the cold heart of the North Atlantic. An iceberg couldn't survive for over 100 years. It couldn't drift that far south and west, against the major currents, into the Gulf of Maine. It would have melted decades ago. It should be nothing but a memory, a ghost story told to spook greenhorn sailors. And yet, here it was, a silent, frozen witness, sitting in my fishing grounds. I had to be sure. I had to touch it. I eased the sea heather closer, so close I could feel the cold seeping through the hull. The air was still. The fog, a thick shroud that made it feel like we were the only two things in the entire world. Me and this relic. I grabbed my longest gaff, the one I use for snaring rogue lines. Its 10-foot wooden pole felt like a toothpick. I nudged the boat right up against the ice wall. The hull scraped against it with a low, groaning sound that went right through me. Reaching out as far as I could, I jabbed the gaff's metal hook towards the edge of the black scar. It hit with a dull thud. I scraped at it, trying to chip a piece away. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sharp crack, a chunk of ice the size of my fist broke free, falling onto the deck with a heavy clatter. I shut down the engine and knelt, my old knees complaining. There, on the weathered wood of my deck, was a piece of that impossible iceberg. And frozen deep inside it, like a prehistoric insect in amber, was a single, black flake of paint. I picked it up. The cold was so intense it burned my fingers. But I didn't care. I held it up to the gray light. It was real. Solid. I could see the texture of the steel it had been peeled from, a faint pattern of rivets frozen into its back. This was not a trick of the light. It was not a hallucination brought on by fog and solitude. It was a piece of a ship. A very specific ship. My whole body started to shake. Not from the cold. It was the sheer, crushing weight of what I was looking at. This wasn't just a piece of history. This was the weapon, a tombstone. The single object responsible for one of the greatest tragedies the sea had ever known. It had carried its secret, its guilt, in silence for more than a century, and now, for reasons I couldn't begin to understand, it had chosen my patch of ocean to reveal itself. This was too big for me. This was too big for any one man. This wasn't a fish story to be told over a beer at the docks. This was something that belonged to the world. With a trembling hand, I stumbled back into the cabin and reached for the radio handset. The plastic felt cold and heavy. My thumb hovered over the transmit button. What was I even going to say? How do you tell the Coast Guard you found a ghost? They'd think I was drunk, or that I'd finally lost my mind after 50 years at sea. Coast Guard, this is Lobster Boat Sea Heather. I found something. Out here near Jordan Ridge. An iceberg. I could already hear the bored sigh on the other end. Yeah, a big one, I continued, my voice cracking. But there's something on it. Something in it. I think you need to see this. I felt like I was pulling a pin from a grenade, with no idea how big the explosion would be. Would you have dared to make that call? To pull that pin, knowing it could change everything? Let me know what you would have done. And be sure to subscribe, because you're going to want to hear what they said when they finally arrived. It took less than 3 hours for the sound of a different engine to cut through the silence. It was a deep, powerful thrum that vibrated through the hull of the Sea Heather and right up into my bones. A Coast Guard cutter, a sleek, white vessel of purpose and authority, sliced through the fog bank like a knife. It dwarfed my little boat, making me feel like a barnacle on a whale. Their skepticism was a palpable thing, a broadcast louder than their radio. Lobster Boat Sea Heather, we have you on visual, a crisp, young voice said, devoid of any warmth. We're reading a large ice mass on our radar. Is that what you called in? I could hear the unspoken question hanging in the air. Did you really drag us all the way out here for an iceberg, old man? That's the one, I radioed back, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. But you need to look closer. There's something in it, something from a long time ago. There was a pause, a crackle of static that felt like a sigh. 2 men in bright orange survival suits stood on their deck, looking over at me and my impossible discovery. I could see them talking to each other, one of them gesturing towards me with a dismissive flick of his hand. They thought I was a fool. Or worse, a drunk wasting their time. But then, they saw it for themselves. As their cutter circled the berg, the dark scar came into view, and the casual posture of the men on deck stiffened. The radio crackled again, the voice now stripped of its condescending edge. "Roger that. See, Heather, we're deploying an ROV to get a better look." They were all business now. A small crane on their deck lowered a bright yellow submersible, no bigger than a lobster trap, into the frigid water. It whirred to life, its lights cutting through the murky green depths as it made its way towards the iceberg. They invited me aboard the cutter to watch the feed. Standing in their high-tech bridge, surrounded by glowing screens and the low hum of electronics, felt like being in another world. My own cabin, with its worn wooden wheel and faded photographs, was a century away. We all huddled around a large monitor, the only sound the quiet instructions of the ROV operator. The camera's light swept across the pitted, blue-black ice. It was like flying over a dead planet. Then, the black scar filled the screen. The ROV followed the gash down deeper and deeper, below the waterline where the ice was densest. And then we saw it. A glint of metal, not a natural rock formation, but something smooth, flat, and man-made, entombed in the ice. "We have metal fragments," the operator said, his voice a low monotone. "Looks like riveted plates. Multiple plates, fused together by the ice." A new person stepped forward, a young man who hadn't been in a uniform. He had the pale, indoor look of a scientist. He'd been brought along from the Woods Hole Institute, just in case my crazy old man story had a sliver of truth to it. He leaned in so close his nose almost touched the screen. "Hold it there," he breathed. "Zoom in on that seam." The camera pushed in, and we could clearly see a row of massive, round-headed rivets, the kind you don't see anymore, holding two thick plates of steel together. The scientist just stared, his face ashen. "We need a sample," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We need a physical piece of it." The ROV had a manipulator arm, but the metal was wedged too deep. There was only one way. A diver, a brave soul named Peterson, suited up. Watching him slip into that black freezing water sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He was tethered to the cutter, a lifeline to the world of the living as he descended into the shadow of the berg. We watched his headlamp on the monitor, a single point of light in the crushing darkness. We saw his gloved hands work with a pry bar, chipping away at the ice around the metal. It took an eternity. Finally, with a wrenching groan that we could feel through the hull, a piece came free. When he surfaced, he was holding a jagged piece of steel plate, about the size of a car door. Frost instantly formed on its surface as it hit the warmer air. They hauled it onto the deck with a winch. It landed with a heavy, final clang, a sound that echoed across the water like a death knell. We all gathered around it. The metal was dark, corroded, but impossibly preserved by its icy prison. The scientist knelt, running a gloved hand over its surface, his expression a mixture of reverence and horror. He pointed to one corner, where the corrosion was less severe. "There," he said. "Look." We all leaned in. Stamped into the steel, faint but unmistakable, were three capital letters. The first was partially obscured, but the last two were as clear as the day they were forged. N, then I, then C. A heavy silence fell over the deck. No one spoke. No one breathed. We all knew. We were standing in the presence of a ghost. The scientist finally stood up, his eyes wide. He looked from the steel plate to the iceberg, and then to me. "My God," he whispered, the words hanging in the frozen air. "It's not a shipwreck. It's the murder weapon." He explained it then, in a rush of scientific theory and historical fact. He talked about the Labrador Current, about freak cold core eddies that could trap and preserve ice for far longer than normal, about a 1 in a billion chance that this specific piece of the Greenland ice sheet could have captured a piece of the doomed liner, and then been caught in a bizarre circular current for a century, a frozen ghost ship in its own private ocean, until some recent shift in the Gulf Stream finally nudged it free, sending it south, right into my path. But the science didn't matter. What mattered was the weight of that object on the deck. It felt like it was radiating not just cold but sorrow. The impossible, unanswered question hung over us all. How? How did it survive for a century? Why did it surface now, right here? It felt less like a discovery, and more like a delivery. A message from the deep. That piece of steel felt like it carried the weight of every soul lost that night. Would you have had the nerve to pull it from the water, knowing the ghosts that might be attached to it? Let me know in the comments. And be sure to subscribe, because what happened next, as the sea began to reclaim its own, is something you won't want to miss. The news of what we'd found, what we were holding, spread through the cutter like a ghost. The radio operator was speaking in hushed, urgent tones to someone far away on land. The scientist was pacing the deck, a manic energy in his eyes, talking a mile a minute about cryopreservation, about building a specialized enclosure, about towing the entire iceberg into a dry dock. He spoke of it like a specimen, a thing to be captured, studied, and put on display. The Coast Guard captain, a practical man with a weathered face, was already discussing logistics, mapping currents, and calculating the risks. They were all looking at a prize, a once-in-a-lifetime discovery that would make their careers. But I wasn't. I was looking at a headstone, a wandering, lonely monument that had been disturbed from its long vigil. Standing there on their clean, gray steel deck, surrounded by their modern technology, I felt a deep and profound sense of trespass. This didn't belong to us. It didn't belong in a museum with velvet ropes and carefully lettered plaques. It belonged to the 1,500 souls who went into that black water with it. It belonged to the sea. The men on the cutter saw a piece of history. I saw a piece of a coffin. The scientist's words about fame and research felt like a desecration, like someone shouting in a church. I stood by the rail, looking out at the ancient ice. In the eerie silence between radio calls, it seemed to breathe. The cold it radiated wasn't just a lack of heat. It felt like an ancient sorrow. I thought of the hands that had riveted that plate, the painters who had laid on that black and red livery, the passengers who had walked the decks above it, full of dreams of a new world. All of them gone, all of them silenced by this one, silent witness. And now, we were going to drag it into the light, poke it, prod it, and put it under glass. It felt wrong. Deep in my bones, it felt fundamentally, terribly wrong. As if it had heard my thoughts, the iceberg groaned. It wasn't the sharp crack of ice breaking, it was a low, mournful sound, like a whale dying in the deep. It vibrated through the water and up into the hull of the cutter. Everyone stopped talking. Every head turned towards the monolith. The scientist cleared his throat. "Thermal stress," he said, a little too quickly. "The temperature differential between the deep ice and the surface water is causing internal fractures. We need to move fast." But the sound wasn't scientific. It was a sigh of weariness. It was the sound of something giving up. Then came another sound, sharper this time. A crack that echoed across the water like a rifle shot. A thin, black line appeared near the top of the berg, a fresh wound spiderwebbing its way down the scarred surface. The Coast Guard captain swore under his breath and grabbed his radio. "It's unstable. All plans to tow are on hold. I want everyone back from the edge." But it was too late. The sea had already made its decision. The groans came faster now, a chorus of deep, resonant thunder that seemed to be coming from the very heart of the ice. The entire structure shuddered. Small pieces began to calve off, splashing into the sea, their impacts loud in the tense silence. We could only watch, helpless. It was like watching a mountain crumble in slow motion. The massive scar, the wound of the Titanic, widened with a wrenching, tearing sound of unimaginable force. For a breathtaking moment, a huge section of the iceberg peeled away and rolled over, exposing a deep, dark blue interior that hadn't seen the light of day in over a century. Then, With a final deafening roar that shook the very air we were breathing, the ancient tombstone gave way. It didn't just sink, it collapsed in on itself, a cataclysm of ice and pressure. The whole magnificent, terrible thing imploded, sliding beneath the waves in a turbulent boil of white water and rising foam. The ocean churned, a great whirlpool marking the spot where it had been, and then it was gone. The silence that fell was more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a finished thing. The silence of a grave finally, properly closed. Where the mountain of ice had stood, there was now only the empty, gray surface of the Gulf of Maine, the fog already creeping back in to reclaim the space. The sea had taken its secret back. We were left with nothing but the memory, and one single, lonely piece of rusted steel lying on the deck. The scientist stared at the empty water, his face a mask of disbelief and loss. The prize had vanished. The history was gone. They took that piece of steel, of course. I read a small article about it a few months later, buried on page 12 of the paper. It mentioned an, quote, unusual metallic artifact recovered from the North Atlantic, now undergoing study in a secure facility. They called it an anomaly, a scientific curiosity. They missed the entire point. The sea didn't give up a secret that day. It delivered a message. It showed us a piece of its memory, reminded us of its power and its sorrow, and then it took it back, leaving us to wonder. It decided what we were allowed to know and what we were not. I still work these waters. The sea heather still chugs her way out of Bar Harbor before the sun comes up. The ocean looks the same. The tides come and go. But for me, it's different now. I know what ghosts it keeps. I know what memories are locked away in its deep, cold heart. And every time I haul a trap from the bottom, every time the fog rolls in and the world goes silent, I can't help but ask myself the same question over and over. Did the ocean bring that iceberg to me to finally share a piece of its truth? Or was it a final, solemn warning to all of us to leave its ghosts alone? What do you think was really behind it all? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe the sea still has stories to tell, make sure you subscribe, because I'm not done listening yet.